When an elderly woman walked into a luxurious restaurant, no one suspected her quiet presence would expose a shocking truth and bring the entire room to a standstill. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the wide glass windows of Ambrose Bistro, a renowned fine dining spot in Seattle, Washington. The air inside was filled with quiet murmurs, the clinking of glasses, and the soft notes of a live pianist in the corner, the kind of place where patrons came to celebrate life's milestones or close lucrative business deals. Amid the polished decor and tailored suits, the entrance door opened to reveal an elderly black woman. Her steps were slow but purposeful, her back straight despite the years etched into her frame. She was dressed in a burgundy coat with delicate embroidery along the cuffs, her small black handbag tucked securely under her arm. Her expression was calm, yet there was a quiet authority about her that turned a few heads. The hostess greeted her with a smile that felt a touch forced, something almost imperceptible but present nonetheless. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, glancing briefly over her shoulder as if to ensure she wasn't holding up the line. "Yes, under the name Ms. Louise Bennett," the woman replied, her voice steady and polite. The hostess scanned the list, nodded, and led her to a table tucked away in a corner near the kitchen. It wasn't the best seat in the house, but Ms. Bennett didn't complain. She took her seat, folded her hands on the table, and glanced at the menu. But something was off. A few moments passed, then several more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Eric, walked past her table multiple times, barely sparing her a glance. When he finally approached, his smile was thin, and his tone carried an edge. "Sorry for the wait," he said briskly. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Ms. Bennett nodded gracefully and thanked him, though nearby tables filled with younger, more casually dressed diners seemed to be receiving immediate and attentive service. She noticed the side glances. A woman 2 tables over whispered something to her partner, both of them sneaking looks in her direction. Another diner furrowed their brow, as if trying to piece together why she seemed so out of place. Minutes turned into what felt like an eternity. Eric returned, but his demeanor was no warmer. "I'm sorry, but we're a little understaffed today. It might be a while before I can get to you," he said, his tone bordering on dismissive. Ms. Bennett's lips pressed into a faint smile. "Take your time," she said, her tone betraying none of the frustration she might have felt. She wasn't about to make a scene, but the discomfort in the air was palpable. Just as she settled back into her chair, seemingly unbothered, someone from across the room noticed everything, and their expression darkened. From her corner seat, Ms. Bennett observed the room with quiet composure. It wasn't her first encounter with this kind of subtle mistreatment, the kind that wasn't loud or overt, but had a way of making itself known in every delayed service and dismissive glance. Still, she remained poised, her hands resting gently on the table as if she were merely passing time. Meanwhile, Eric busied himself with nearby tables, his tone cheerful and his smile effortless as he took orders and cracked jokes with other patrons. When he walked past her table again, without even acknowledging her, the unease among the other diners began to grow. A young couple near the center of the room exchanged nervous glances. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient music. Her partner shrugged, casting a quick glance toward Eric, who seemed completely indifferent. The seconds stretched into minutes, and though Ms. Bennett kept her calm exterior, a small part of her wondered how far this would go. She reached for her water glass, but even that had been left empty. A few tables away, a waiter delivered a fresh glass of wine to a customer who had arrived long after she did. Eric finally returned, carrying a tray of food destined for another table. He paused briefly as he passed Ms. Bennett. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone bordering on dismissive, as though the delay were her fault. She looked up at him, her eyes steady and kind, but with a quiet intensity that made him falter. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her voice measured and polite. Eric nodded, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. But a few tables away, someone else had been watching closely. At a table near the bar, a man in his late 30s sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water. dressed in a crisp navy blazer. His demeanor was calm but sharp. His eyes narrowed as he observed Eric's behavior. He had been quietly taking note of every interaction, every slight, and every dismissive glance. His fingers tapped lightly on the table as his expression grew colder with each passing minute. For now, he stayed silent, his gaze darting between Ms. Bennett and the staff. He wasn't just any diner. He was the restaurant's owner. And Ms. Bennett wasn't just any patron. She was his mother. But he wasn't ready to step in just yet. He wanted to see how far this would go, how Eric would treat someone he assumed was powerless. His jaw tightened as Eric laughed with another table, oblivious to the storm brewing on the other side of the room. The tension was building, and though Ms. Bennett remained calm, the air in the restaurant grew heavier with every passing second. Something had to give, and it was only a matter of time. Across the room, Elijah Bennett leaned back in his chair, his fingers still rhythmically tapping the edge of the table. He wasn't the type to lose his temper easily. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him that patience was often the most powerful tool in his arsenal. But this was different. Watching his mother endure the subtle but deliberate mistreatment filled him with a slow-burning anger. Elijah had poured his heart into building Ambrose Bistro. It was more than just a business. It was a testament to the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, and fairness. She had been his anchor through years of struggle, the voice in his ear reminding him to keep pushing forward when the odds were stacked against him. Now, seeing her treated as though she didn't belong in a space he had created felt personal. He noticed the way Eric avoided her table, the way he smiled effortlessly at other guests, while his expression hardened whenever he glanced her way. Elijah caught the faint smirk Eric gave another server. As if sharing an unspoken joke, his grip tightened around his glass. The restaurant was his domain, his pride. Every detail, from the menu to the decor, bore his mark. Yet at this moment, he felt powerless. Elijah's thoughts raced. Should he confront Eric now and make an example of him in front of the entire restaurant? Or should he wait and let the moment unfold, ensuring there was no room for excuses later? He chose the latter. He signaled to the manager, a middle-aged woman named Karen, who approached his table cautiously. "Keep an eye on table 14, he said under his breath, nodding toward his mother. "I want to see how Eric handles this. Don't intervene yet." Karen hesitated but nodded. She knew better than to question Elijah when his tone was that firm. Elijah's focus returned to his mother. She was now looking at her watch, her movements deliberate and calm. She wasn't going to complain. He knew that much. Complaints had never been her way. She believed in letting actions speak louder than words. But Elijah also believed in actions. And soon, Eric would see the consequences of his. The tension in the restaurant had become impossible to ignore. Conversations had quieted, and more patrons were stealing glances at Ms. Bennett. Eric, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened. As he passed by her table again, she politely raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice cutting through the murmurs around her. Eric paused, his expression tightening with impatience. "Yes," he replied curtly, barely masking his irritation. "I'd like to place my order now. If you're not too busy," she said, maintaining her grace. Eric sighed audibly, glancing around as if to find an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. At that moment, Elijah rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The room seemed to shift as he crossed it, his presence commanding. Without a word, he reached Eric just as the waiter was joking with another table. The casual arrogance on Eric's face quickly melted into confusion when he noticed Elijah standing beside him. "Elijah, hey," Eric stammered, attempting a smile. "I didn't know you were here." "I've been here," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "And I've been watching." Eric's smile faltered. "Watching what?" Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table, then back to Eric. "Watching you ignore my mother, who's been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water." The color drained from Eric's face. He glanced toward Miss Bennett, who was now sitting upright, her calm gaze locked on the interaction. "Why your mother?" Eric stammered. his voice cracking. Yes, my mother, Elijah said, his tone sharpening. The woman you've treated like an inconvenience. The woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect you've been showering on every other table in this room. The restaurant fell silent. All eyes were now on them. Even the pianist had stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys. Eric opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah cut him off. Save it, he said, his voice cold. There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it. Elijah turned to the manager, who had been hovering near the bar, unsure whether to intervene. Karen, he said, his voice steady, take over table 14 and make sure my mother has everything she needs immediately. Karen nodded quickly and rushed toward Miss Bennett's table, offering her a flurry of apologies as she filled her water glass and handed her a menu. Elijah turned back to Eric, his expression unreadable. We'll discuss your future here later. For now, you're done for the day. Go home. Eric stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of humiliation and regret. Then, without a word, he untied his apron and walked out of the restaurant, the heavy door swinging shut behind him. The silence lingered for a beat longer before Elijah approached his mother's table. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his stern demeanor softening into something warmer. You okay, Mom? He asked quietly. Ms. Bennett smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. I'm fine, son. You handled that well? Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. I should have stepped in sooner. No, she replied gently. You let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away. As the restaurant returned to its usual hum of activity, it was clear that no one would forget what had just happened or the lesson it carried. The atmosphere in Ambrose Bistro had shifted. Conversations picked up again, but the air was heavier, more thoughtful. Patrons who had witnessed the scene now looked at Ms. Bennett with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. Elijah returned to his table, his face still composed, though the lingering anger in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. Meanwhile, Karen ensured Ms. Bennett's meal was served promptly, personally presenting the dishes with an apology so heartfelt it felt as though she were trying to undo the actions of the entire evening. Ms. Bennett accepted the apology with her usual grace, offering a small nod before turning her attention to the food. She didn't need grand gestures or speeches. Her quiet dignity had spoken volumes already. At another table, a young couple who had been observing the entire situation leaned toward each other. I can't believe he treated her like that, the woman whispered, shaking her head. It makes you think about how often this happens and no one says anything. Her partner nodded thoughtfully. It's not just about what you see. It's about what you're willing to stand up against when it happens. Elijah overheard their exchange as he passed their table on his way back to his mother. Their words stayed with him. He thought about the countless times people like Eric had gotten away with mistreatment simply because no one had been watching or cared enough to intervene. When Elijah sat down beside his mother, she reached across the table and took his hand. You've built something beautiful here, Elijah, she said softly. But remember, a place like this isn't just about food or ambience. It's about how people feel when they walk through those doors. I know, Mom, Elijah replied, his voice tinged with regret. I let you down tonight. She shook her head. No, you didn't. You gave everyone here a chance to see the truth, and you handled it with integrity. That's what matters. Around them, the staff seemed more attentive, the service more thoughtful. It wasn't just about avoiding another incident. It was about the unspoken lesson Elijah's actions had taught them all. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Ms. Bennett finished her meal, she glanced around the room, her gaze settling briefly on Karen, who gave her a small, apologetic smile. There was no bitterness in her expression, only a quiet satisfaction that the moment had left an impression. But for Elijah, the lesson wasn't just for Eric or the staff. It was a reminder for himself too. Leadership wasn't just about managing operations. It was about upholding the values that made his restaurant a place worth visiting. As the evening wound down, Ms. Bennett prepared to leave, her calm demeanor unchanged. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped out into the crisp evening air. For a moment, they stood there together, the glow from the restaurant's windows illuminating their faces. "You did good, son," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that softened the day's tension. Elijah smiled faintly. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a hand on his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's the real change." He nodded, watching as she made her way to the car waiting by the curb. Before getting in, she turned back and offered him one last smile. Inside the restaurant, the staff worked quietly to close up, the earlier incident still fresh in their minds. Karen gathered the team for a brief meeting, her tone serious yet constructive. "What happened tonight is a wake-up call," she began. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the culture we're creating here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. No exceptions." The staff nodded, their expressions solemn. Eric's absence was palpable, a reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professionalism. As Elijah returned inside, he glanced around the emptying dining room. The events of the evening weighed on him, but they also reaffirmed his commitment to making Ambrose Bistro more than just a restaurant. It had to be a place where dignity and kindness were served alongside the finest meals. For the guests who had witnessed it all, the night would linger in their minds. They had come for fine dining but left with a story that reminded them of the power of respect, the importance of standing up, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to let injustice define them. And to you, watching, ask yourself, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stood by and let